Hi, my name is James, and I'm here to discuss my opinion on free speech and why it should not be controlled in a liberal democracy more than it already is. Here's why. First, let's look at liberal democracy and how it compares to other organizations of governments. What separates liberal democracy is that the laws are centered around protecting the rights of the individual. Think of this block as the individual. As kids, we learned that you can stack them to make just about whatever you want. It can be recognizable or something unrecognizable from our imagination. This block is the most common unit of that creation. So representing an individual, it represents a unit of a society. A group of blocks can represent a community, a social class, a culture, or some sect of society. Multiple groups of blocks represent a race, region, province, and a conglomerate of multiple groups can represent a country. As this block represents individual human beings, let's give it all of human characteristics that make it unique. It lives a life, it grows up, it makes choices, it learns, it develops relationships, it creates enemies, it's attracted to certain other blocks, and repels others. This is human nature, and it occurs in all forms of social organization, whether it's democracy, authoritarian, dictatorship, or communism, just to name a few. These blocks will interact with other blocks in some way, shape, or form. And it is whether these blocks are organized into a shape or form that will determine our society structure. An authoritarian state draws its strength and legitimacy from the individual blocks conforming to the will of the government in the name of the state. Authoritarianism needs conformity for it to exist, so it is rigid and clearly defined, much like a shape. Now, when we talk about shape, this could be a diamond, a star, a square, a circle. It doesn't matter. Not all authoritarian regimes are alike, as long as it is a distinguishable shape and doesn't fall apart. To keep its shape, the interactions of the individual blocks within it that are naturally occurring need to be controlled. How the individual works, thinks, makes choices, and interacts with other individual blocks will be kept in check for the integrity of the shape. Now, you might think, what purpose or benefit does the authoritarian state have as a rigid shape? For starters, it is rather efficient in terms of government. It is fairly easy for authoritarian government to carry out grand national plans because it will employ every tool at its disposal, including violence, to carry out matters of state. Joseph Stalin, for instance, rapidly industrialized the Soviet Union in a series of initiatives called the Five-Year Plans. This was astonishing since it took other European countries the better part of the 18th and 19th centuries to accomplish this feat. Many things can be accomplished with authoritarianism, but usually at the detriment of individual blocks. Such is the consequence of a system that is indifferent to the interactions of the blocks and pushes its will from the top down. So what happens if we switch that flow of power so it comes from the bottom up? When the authority comes from the bottom up, it's the individual block who has the power to make a choice. It has the freedom to elect its government. This is democracy. Liberal democracy is simply enhancing that freedom of choice with other liberal ideologies, such as the right of and freedoms of the individual, own property, and make one's own destiny. Now, when everyone has a free choice in matters of no one will ever agree 100% on any issue. Heck, even getting above 50% consensus would be a miracle. This is why we have majority rules. A consequence of this is that liberal democracy will never have the homogeneous discipline to form a shape. But this is a celebrated consequence, because the blocks are free to move and interact as they naturally want to. Blocks can move as individually or as a group. It doesn't matter, because the whole structure is not at risk of falling apart, because it is a form, not a shape. There is no outline or mold to break. It's fluid, and that gives it its strength. Because it is fluid, it can adapt to challenges and differences and still be considered a form. Now, if this is still too abstract and silly, consider this. Canadian society is often described as a mosaic. American society is described as a melting pot. These entities neither have the rigidity of an absolute outline shape because the blocks within them are free to arrange as they please and still be a mosaic and a melting pot. In a liberal democracy, the blocks are held together by cohesion, not conformity. Rigidity is replaced by fluidness and adaptability because what it looks like is secondary to the importance of the block, just as the rights of an individual are secondary to the state. Here's why freedom of speech is so important. So important, it's probably the most important of all the freedoms. In a liberal democracy, freedom of speech has far broader connotation than the name implies. People wrongfully interpret freedom of speech to mean to say whatever you want, to whom you want, whenever you want. It's not. Amnesty International summarized the true meaning of freedom of speech like this. Freedom of speech is the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds by any means. Frankly, a more appropriate term would be freedom to communicate. Because when you realize that it's more about communication, you can understand why freedom of speech is the most important precursor to many of the other freedoms in a liberal democracy. The press can't be free to report unless they have the ability and mediums to communicate those reports to the masses. Freedom of assembly and protest can't exist unless the protesters are free to convey their message. Freedom of expression can be considered an extension of freedom of speech, as is simply the marketplace where the act of communicating ideas take place. You have a right to speak, but you also have the right to be heard. Now, what I just described is classified as a libertarian point of view. I am a libertarian, and I do believe that liberties of the individual need to be protected and have the least amount of government necessary. But that doesn't mean I don't think there should not be government. Critics of libertarians might label me as a right-wing or even far-right because of the perception that the protection of liberties only benefits the few and ignores the many social injustices in our society, such as racism, poverty, bigotry, etc., etc. This is judging a book by its cover and is in line with thinking that free speech is about saying whatever you want. The very thought that one group of people holds the benefit over another group goes against the very notion of a liberal democracy. That's an authoritarian society does. John Stuart Mill, often considered the leading philosopher on social libertarianism, wrote about something called the harm principle. The harm principle explains that protection of individual rights for the purposes of self-determination is not an absolute. An action which results in doing harm to another, like hate or calls of violence, is not only wrong, but wrong enough it could be considered illegal, requiring the government to intervene on behalf of other individuals. We find this harm principle already in our laws, through the hate speech laws, libel laws, and laws against advocating violence. As a libertarian, I am all for these laws because those things are not beliefs and ideas that hold power, because those things are beliefs that hold power over another group, which is, again, goes against the libertarian core beliefs. What I am against is the implementation of more laws restricting free speech than what we already have. Because when we start to restrict free speech, we risk limiting the cornerstone freedom that upholds our other freedoms and our beautiful mosaic, and we might start to resemble a shape. Thank you for your time.